The small, sunlit studio in the heart of the city felt like a world of its own, far removed from the bustle of streetcars and crowded sidewalks just outside its windows. Clara's hands, steady and precise, worked with practiced grace over the canvas before her. Her brushstrokes were deliberate yet fluid, mixing vibrant splashes of color with deep, ominous shadows. An abstract composition that had begun to take shape over the past few weeks now hung in midair, an undefined figure, almost alive, poised to leap off the canvas. Clara had always found solace in her art. As a painter, her entire existence revolved around the world she could create with nothing but color and shape. Yet today, as her brush moved, there was an unshakable feeling that something was different, something wrong. Her instincts told her it was just the exhaustion of working for hours without rest, the strain of bringing a concept to life, but deep down she knew this was no ordinary painting. There was a power brewing, one that she hadn't meant to summon. She had been experimenting with the abstract for months, intentionally letting her imagination roam free in ways that weren't restrained by form or logic. At first, it felt like liberation, but with each piece, her subjects began to evolve. Distorted faces, twisted shapes, and impossible angles that seemed to hold a strange significance. She had chalked it up to the natural progression of her creative journey, but today, as the paint dried on the canvas, something more sinister tugged at the edge of her mind. The air in the room thickened, and for a brief moment, Clara paused, feeling an odd shiver run through her spine. She shook it off and reached for her next color. But as she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, like a faint ripple in the fabric of reality itself. The faint creak of the door opening behind her made her spin around, heart pounding. No one was there. Her brow furrowed. She turned back to the canvas, thinking she had imagined the sound, only to find that the abstract shape she'd been working on had subtly shifted. What was once a jumble of disconnected lines now resembled something that almost looked like a figure, albeit incomplete. A twisted silhouette, like something straight out of a fever dream. Clara stepped back uneasy. She hadn't painted that. Not consciously, anyway. Suddenly, the room seemed to pulse with energy. The air grew warmer, heavy with something unidentifiable. With a gasp, Clara realized the silhouette on the canvas had begun to move. It was subtle at first, just a twitch, like a flicker in the corner of her eye, but the movement became more pronounced, more deliberate. The painted figure, once confined to the limits of the canvas, was now stretching beyond its boundaries. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the lines of the figure contort and writhe, each stroke growing longer, more distinct. It seemed almost alive. As Clara reached for the canvas, her fingers grazed the edge, sending a jolt of cold electricity through her skin. The figure wasn't just moving, it was expanding, and it was coming to life. Before she could react, the image on the canvas leapt toward her, pulling her into a violent whirlwind of color and sound. The world around her seemed to dissolve, the studio vanishing into nothingness. Her surroundings spun and blurred, the boundaries between art and reality completely collapsing. Clara cried out as the space around her warped into a strange, unrecognizable landscape. When the spinning stopped, Clara found herself standing in the middle of a vast, empty expanse. The air smelled faintly of paint, acrylic, oil, and something else, something metallic. She spun around, trying to understand what was happening. But the world around her was a swirl of shifting colors, impossible shapes, and abstract forms. It was her painting. Her imagination had bled into the real world, and she was trapped inside it. The figures she had created, once mere brushstrokes on a canvas, now hovered in the air, their movements erratic, as if unsure of their own existence. They were grotesque, twisted versions of what she had painted, surreal and alien, but somehow familiar, like they were distorted fragments of her own psyche. Some were distorted faces with long, tendril-like arms. Others were geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Clara's heart raced. This was madness. How could this be happening? Suddenly, one of the shapes shifted and turned toward her. It was a figure, tall and angular, its body covered in a mosaic of fragmented, shifting colors. Its face was obscured, but Clara felt its gaze. Cold, calculating, and full of intent. Without warning, the figure lunged toward her. Clara stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears, but there was nowhere to run. She closed her eyes and braced herself, expecting to be engulfed by whatever twisted creation she had conjured. But just as quickly as it had come, the figure stopped. It hovered before her, and for a moment, there was silence, unsettlingly still. Then, the figure reached out, extending one of its bizarre, multi-jointed arms, and pressed a single finger to her forehead. Clara gasped as she felt a surge of energy pass through her. It was as if the figure was extracting something from her, a part of herself that she hadn't realized was there, hidden beneath the surface of her mind. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the studio. The room was still and quiet. The painting was right in front of her, as though nothing had happened at all. But something had changed. Clara could feel it deep within her. The painting was no longer just an abstract work. It was alive, and the figure on the canvas was watching her, waiting. Days passed, and Clara found herself unable to shake the feeling that she was being followed. At night, she would hear the soft scratching of nails on the floorboards, only to find nothing when she checked. Her paintings, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like portals to another world, one where her creations lived and breathed, and where they began to shape the world around her. Soon, the figures from her paintings began to manifest more frequently, first in subtle ways. A flicker in the corner of her eye, a strange rustling in the shadows. Then, they began to emerge more fully. The first time she saw one of them standing in her kitchen, a towering figure with shifting geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, Clara's blood ran cold. The creature didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone sent a wave of fear through her. It was no longer just a piece of art. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was aware of her. Clara's mind spiraled. Had she lost control of her own creativity? Had her imagination become a force too powerful to contain? Desperate for answers, Clara began researching old occult texts, looking for any mention of an artist whose creations had come to life. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. There were ancient legends about the power of art, about artists who could manipulate reality itself, creating things that would transcend the boundaries of their work and manifest in the real world. But the texts also warned of a curse. Once an artist's creations came to life, they could never be undone. As the days wore on, the figures began to interact with the people around her. They were no longer content to stay hidden. They stepped into her world, unfurling their limbs and manipulating the people who crossed their path, sometimes subtly, other times violently. Clara watched in horror as one of her creations, a grotesque amalgamation of sharp edges and twisted forms, attacked a friend who had come to visit. The friend was left terrified, his mind shattered from the encounter. It was clear now. Her paintings were alive, and they were out of control. Clara's only hope was to find a way to reverse the curse before the figures grew too powerful. With time running out, she set to work on a new painting, one she hoped would bring the nightmare to an end. She carefully chose each color, each line, each shape, determined to create something that could contain the otherworldly beings she had unleashed. But as she painted, something shifted within her. The line between the artist and the art began to blur. Her hands moved not out of choice, but out of some unseen force guiding them, urging her to keep painting. The more she worked, the more her mind seemed to unravel, until she was no longer sure whether she was creating the final piece of salvation or the final piece of destruction. With the last brushstroke, Clara stepped back. The painting was complete, but when she looked at the canvas, she saw not just her creation, but the end of everything. The final stroke had summoned a new figure, one so powerful, so vast, it dwarfed everything she had created before. It towered over the room, its presence overwhelming and incomprehensible. And as Clara realized what she had done, she knew there was no way to stop it now. Her imagination had come to life, and it was taking over the world.